The rain came in soft against the windows of the little cottage tonight, the way it had come in 1,000 nights before, and an old woman named Edith sat by the fire with a folded quilt across her lap and her hands resting on it, very still. It was an old quilt, and a beautiful one, pieced together square by square over the long years of a marriage, and there was a story stitched into every single panel of it. But there was one square in the very last corner that had never been finished. For 3 years it had stayed that way, a small bare patch of waiting at the edge of a whole warm life. And tonight, with the rain falling and the fire low, Edith had finally taken out her needle and decided that she would finish it. She did not yet know what she would find when she did. Welcome to the Lamplit Hour, where every story is a small light left on for someone who needs it. If stories like this bring you comfort, take a moment to subscribe and stay a while. So let the rain keep falling, soft and steady on the roof, and let the fire settle into its quiet orange glow, and let us stay here, you and I, in this small, warm room while the night does its work outside. Let me tell you about Edith and the rain and the quilt that held a whole life inside it. Edith was 76 years old, and she had lived in this cottage for more than 50 of those years. It was a small place, low and snug, set at the end of a gravel lane where the hills came down to meet a gray lake. And in the autumn and the winter, the rain came often, sweeping in off the water in long, soft curtains that you could hear before you could see. Most people, she knew, would have found it lonely. Edith had never once found it so. She loved the sound of the rain on the roof. She loved the way the cottage gathered the warmth in close on a wet night, the lamps making little pools of gold, the fire ticking in the grate, the windows running with silver. On nights like this, the whole world seemed to draw a blanket up over itself and go quiet, and Edith, who had grown old in this room, felt held by it the way a child feels held. She lived alone now. Her husband, Henry, had died 3 winters ago in the spring, just before the rains gave way to the long light of summer. They had been married for 51 years. People sometimes asked her gently, in the careful way people ask such things, whether she was all right out here on her own, so far down the lane. And Edith always told them the truth, which was that she was. She missed Henry the way you miss your own hand, constantly and without drama, but the cottage was full of him, and the hills were full of him, and the rain still sounded exactly the way it had sounded on the night he first brought her here, a young bride with everything ahead of her, and so in a way she was never entirely without him. He had simply gone into the walls and the weather. That was how she had come to think of it. On a wet evening such as this one, in the years before tonight, Edith kept to the small, soft rituals that had carried her through. She would put the kettle on the stove and let it climb slowly to its whistle, and she would make a pot of tea and set it on the hob to keep, and she would bank the fire up just enough and turn the one good lamp toward her chair and sit. She did not keep the radio on much anymore. She found she preferred the rain. There is a particular conversation a cottage has with the rain on a winter night, a low and endless and comfortable murmur, the drops on the glass and the drip from the eaves and the deeper hush of the whole hillside drinking it in. And Edith had been listening to that conversation for 50 years and had never grown tired of a single word of it. The cottage held the warmth close on nights like these. The windows wept their long silver streaks, and in her chair by the fire, with her tea going cool at her elbow and the lamplight gold on her hands, Edith would feel the day let go of her, one knot at a time, until she was nothing but an old woman in a warm room listening to the rain, which was, she had decided long ago, very near to the best thing a person could be. The fire shifted, and a small flame stood up, and the light moved across the quilt on her lap, and Edith spread her old hands flat upon it and looked at it for a long while. It was, she thought, the truest thing she owned. Not the most valuable, though an antique dealer who had come down the lane one summer had offered her a startling sum for it, and gone away disappointed. Not the most beautiful, though it was beautiful in its faded, patient way, but the truest, because Edith and Henry had not bought this quilt, and they had not been given it. They had made it, the two of them, one square at a time, across the entire length of their marriage. And every square was a year, and every year was a piece of cloth that meant something, so that the whole quilt, laid out flat in the lamplight, was nothing less than a map of their life together, drawn in fabric and thread. It had been Henry's idea in the beginning, though he would never have called it an idea. He was not a man for ideas, only for quiet, steady doing. In the first winter of their marriage, when they were young and poor, and the rain had kept them in for a week, he had come home with a small square of blue cloth cut from the shirt he had been married in, worn through at the elbow, and no good for wearing any more. And he had said, in his plain way, "We ought to keep this." And Edith had taken it, and because she was the one who could sew, she had backed it and bound it, and made it into the first square of what neither of them yet knew would become a quilt. And the next winter, when the rains came again and kept them in by the fire, she had looked at that single square and thought, well, it wants company. And so she had cut a piece from the curtains of their first home, the home they had just left for this cottage, a soft yellow with little flowers, and she had made the second square. And that was how it began. That was how a marriage learned to keep itself. Every winter after that, when the rains came and the lane turned to mud, and the two of them were shut up cozy together with the fire and the lamps, they would choose the cloth for that year's square. It became their ceremony, the thing that marked the turning of the year far more than any calendar. They would sit, just as Edith sat now, and they would talk about what the year had held, and they would decide together which scrap of it deserved to be sewn into the quilt forever. Henry chose the cloth, and Edith did the sewing, and that division had suited them both for half a century. He had an unerring eye, she always said, for the piece of a year that mattered, and she had the hands to keep it. She could see one such evening even now, as clear as if it were happening in the chair beside her. It was perhaps their 20th winter. The rain had come early that year and hard, and they had been shut in for days. And on the third night, Henry had gone to the drawer where he kept his bits of cloth and come back with two scraps, held one in each hand. He laid them on the table under the lamp without a word and looked at her, which was his way of asking. One was a piece of bright cotton from the curtains of the room their daughter had just moved into, grown and gone at last to a home of her own. The other was a square of plain brown wool from the coat he had worn to the funeral of his oldest friend that autumn. Two pieces of 1 year, the joy and the grief of it, and only one could be the square. They had sat a long time over those two scraps, the rain coming down, the fire low. And in the end, Henry had picked up the bright cotton and set the brown wool gently aside and said, in his plain way, "We'll remember the sad ones without help. Let the quilt be for the glad ones." And Edith had sewn the bright cotton into the quilt that night and understood, not for the first time, that she had married a wiser man than either of them ever said aloud. That was the kind of thing he knew, sitting quietly by the fire with a scrap of cloth in each hand. That was the eye she had married. It is a strange and lovely thing to have a tradition like that running through a marriage. It gave their years a shape they might otherwise have lacked. Other people marked time by birthdays and anniversaries, by the big loud milestones. But Edith and Henry had marked theirs by the quiet turning toward winter, by the first long rains coming in off the lake. By the evening they would finally sit down with a tin of scraps between them and ask each other, well, what was this year then? It made them pay attention. It made them keep watch on their own life as it went by, so that nothing passed entirely unnoticed, so that every year had to answer the question of what in it had been worth keeping, and almost always, when they truly thought about it, there had been something, even the hard years, even the thin years. Somewhere in each of them was a scrap of cloth that meant the year had not been wasted, that they had come through it together, that there had been at least one thing warm enough to sew into the record and carry forward. Edith thought sometimes that the quilt had taught them how to be happy, or at least how to notice that they already were, which may come to very nearly the same thing in the end. If this story is staying with you, a quiet light helps me keep the lamp lit for others. She let her fingers travel across the squares now, in the firelight, reading them the way another woman might read a diary. Here, near the center, was a small piece of pale flannel, soft and worn, nearly to nothing, cut from the blanket of the baby they had been given, and then before a single year was out, had to give back to heaven. They had not spoken much about that, Henry and Edith. They were not people who had the words. But he had brought her the scrap of that blanket that winter without saying anything at all, and laid it in her lap, and she had understood that he was telling her they would carry it always, the two of them together, sewn safe into the middle of their life where it would be warm. And she had made it into a square, and her tears had fallen on it as she sewed, and that was the only grave that child had ever needed. Here was a strip of green corduroy from the jacket Henry had worn the year he finally had work that was steady. Here was a piece of the dress she had worn to their daughter's wedding, the daughter who had come to them late and unlooked for and saved them, a deep wine red that had faded now to the color of a rose pressed in a book. Here was a square of striped ticking from the deck, chairs of the one real holiday they had ever taken, a week by the sea when they were 60, both of them sunburned and astonished at their own daring. Here was a piece of a flowered apron, cut from the apron Edith's own mother had worn at the stove every day of her life, given to Edith the winter the old woman died, so that her mother too was sewn into the quilt and kept warm in it forever. Here was a narrow band of faded khaki from the kit bag of Henry's brother, who had gone away to a war as a young man and come home changed and quiet, and lived out his days 3 valleys over, and whom Henry had loved without ever quite knowing how to say so. Here was a small square of cheerful red gingham from a tablecloth, the tablecloth they had spread on the grass the summer the whole family came at once, all the children and the children's children, the one golden afternoon when the cottage had been full to the rafters with noise, and the lane lined with cars. Here was a patch of soft butter yellow from the very first thing Edith had ever sewn for the daughter who came to them late, a tiny gown for a tiny girl, kept all these years, and at last cut down to the size of a single square. Here was tartan from a winter of illness they had come through. Here was the soft gray of the suit Henry had worn to too many funerals as the years thinned out the people they had loved. 50 squares, 50 winters, a whole life, kept warm and kept together, one rainy season at a time. And then in the last corner, the 51st square, the empty one. Edith looked at it for a long time, there in the firelight, with the rain coming down outside. It should have been finished 3 springs ago. By rights it would have been. They were nothing if not faithful to their ceremony. But that had been the winter. Henry was ill. He had grown tired that autumn, and quiet, and then, as the rains came on, properly sick, and they both came slowly to understand that this was the winter he would not come through. And so they had not done the square. There had been other things to attend to, gentler and harder things. The long, careful business of saying goodbye to someone you have loved for 51 years without ever once making it sound like goodbye. The quilt had lain in its chest, untouched, with its one bare corner waiting. She thought about that last autumn often, and she thought about it now, by the fire, with his note not yet found in the tin. He had grown so gentle at the end. That was the thing she had not expected. Henry had always been a kind man, but a plain one, undemonstrative, a man who showed his love by mending the gate and keeping the woodpile dry rather than by saying soft things. But in those last months, as the strength went out of him and the rains came on, he had turned quiet in a new way, a watchful and tender way, and she had caught him more than once, simply looking at her across the room, looking at her as though he were learning her by heart, as though he were storing something up. She had thought at the time that it was only the illness making him sentimental. She had not understood that he was at work, that even then, tired as he was choosing the cloth and folding it, and pinning his last words to it, and laying it where she would find it, that the long looks across the room were a man taking the measure of the woman he was about to leave warm. She had thought she was the one keeping watch over him. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out, in the gentlest possible way, and Henry had died in the spring, and Edith, when at last she had taken the quilt out again the following winter, had found that she could not bring herself to finish it. To sew that final square would be to close the book. It would mean that the marriage was a finished thing, a completed object, a quilt with no more squares to come. And she had not been ready for that. For 3 years, she had not been ready. But tonight, she thought, watching the firelight move on the empty corner, tonight, she believed she was. She was 76. The rain was falling the way it had always fallen. And it seemed to her, all of a sudden and very gently, that to leave their life unfinished was a sadder thing than to complete it. Henry would not have wanted a quilt with a bare corner. Henry believed in finishing what you began, in sewing the year up tight before you let it go. And so she had taken the quilt from its chest and threaded her needle by the lamp. And now she had only to choose the cloth. That was where she faltered, because choosing the cloth had always been Henry's part. 50 times he had chosen, and 50 times she had sewn, and she did not know now how to do the choosing herself. What piece of cloth could possibly stand for that last year, the year of his illness, the year of the long goodbye? What scrap of all the world could hold it? She sat with the empty square before her, and her threaded needle in her hand, and she did not know where to begin. And for a moment, the old grief rose up in her, plain and constant as ever, and she thought perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps it could not be finished after all. And then she remembered the tin. In the bottom of the quilt chest, beneath where the quilt itself had lain, folded all these years, there was an old biscuit tin, dented at one corner, that had held Henry's bits and pieces of cloth, his scraps and remnants, the raw material of 50 winters of choosing. She had not opened it since he died. She had not been able to, but it was there, and she set the quilt aside now and knelt down stiffly by the chest in the firelight and lifted the lid and took out the tin and held it on her lap a moment, the way you hold something that still has a little warmth in it. And then she opened it. Inside were the odds and ends she had expected. Buttons, a thimble worn smooth, a card of pins, small folded squares of cloth he had saved over the years against some future need. And lying on the very top, where it could not be missed, where it had plainly been placed so that it would be the first thing found, was a piece of cloth folded carefully into a neat square and pinned to it a small slip of paper in Henry's hand. Edith's breath went out of her. She knew the cloth at once. Of course she did. She had known it for 52 years. It was a soft, faded blue, worn thin, the same blue, the very same, as the first square of the quilt, the square at the center, cut from the shirt Henry had been married in. He had kept a second piece of it all this time. Half a century he had kept it, tucked in the bottom of the tin, and she had never known. And he had taken it out in that last autumn, when he was tired and quiet and knew what was coming, and he had folded it and pinned a note to it and laid it on the top of the tin where she would be sure to find it. He had chosen the cloth for the final square. He had done his part one last time before he went. He had known that she would not be able to choose it, and so he had chosen it for her and left it waiting the way you leave a lamp burning in a window for someone who is going to come home in the dark. She unpinned the slip of paper with shaking fingers and held it to the lamp and read what he had written in his plain, careful hand, the hand of a man who was not good with words and so had used very few. The last one should match the first. It was all 1 year, really, the whole of it. Finish it warm, my Edith, and wrap yourself up in it, and know that I am in every square. For a long while, Edith could not see to sew, and that was all right, because the rain did not mind waiting, and the fire did not mind, and Henry, wherever he had gone into the walls and the weather, did not mind either. She sat with the blue cloth pressed against her face, and she let the tears come, not the sharp tears of 3 years ago, but something softer and rounder and almost like joy, the kind of weeping that is really a kind of homecoming. He had known all that last autumn, while she had thought she was the one taking care of him. He had been taking care of her, quietly, the way he had taken care of her for 51 years, choosing the cloth, leaving the warmth, making sure that when the time came, she would be able to finish their life and not be left with a bare and broken corner. The last one should match the first. It was all 1 year, really, the whole of it. And then when she could see again, Edith threaded her needle afresh, and she took up the soft blue cloth, and she began to sew the final square. She sewed slowly, the way she had always sewn, the way Henry had loved to watch her sew on winter nights, her head bent, her hands sure, the firelight gold on the side of her face. The rain came down, steady and soft on the roof. The fire ticked and settled, and square by square, the quilt grew whole in her lap, the blue of the last corner answering the blue of the center, the end of the marriage reaching back across 50 years to take the hand of its beginning, so that the whole thing closed at last into a circle, a complete and finished and unbroken round, a life with no bare corners left in it anywhere. It was all 1 year, really. She understood now what he had meant. From the first square to the last, it had been a single long, warm winter's evening by a single fire, and she had been lucky, luckier than she had ever let herself know, to have spent the whole of it beside him. And as she sewed, the years came up to meet her, one after another, the way they do when your hands are busy with quiet work and your mind is free to wander where it likes. She did not hurry them. She let them come. The young man who had carried her over the threshold of this very cottage in the rain, laughing, both of them soaked through, the smell of bread in the early years when they had little else, the sound of Henry's boots on the gravel of the lane coming home, a sound she would know among 10,000, gone now, but not gone, was sown into the hush of the rain. The long, ordinary tens of thousands of evenings, most of them exactly like this one, the two of them by the fire, not always talking, not needing to. Two people who had grown so used to each other's quiet that the silence between them had become its own kind of conversation. None of it had felt remarkable while it was happening. That was the secret nobody tells you about a happy life, Edith thought, drawing the blue thread through the blue cloth. It does not feel like anything much while you are living it. It only feels like Tuesday and rain and tea going cool and a man you love in the chair across from you. It is only afterward, sewing the last square by a low fire, that you see it was the whole of everything and that you were happy the entire time and never quite knew. It was very late when she set the last stitch and bit the thread and smoothed the finished quilt flat upon her knees. The fire had burned down to a deep red glow. The rain had softened to almost nothing, a faint silver whisper on the glass. Edith sat and looked at the completed quilt, all 51 squares of it, the whole of a marriage held warm in her 2 hands. And she did not feel, as she had feared she would, that she had closed a book. She felt instead that she had been given something back. The quilt was not finished in the way that a thing is finished when it is over. It was finished in the way that a thing is finished when it is whole. And then, because Henry had told her to, because it was the last instruction he had ever left her, and she had always been one to do as he asked, Edith stood slowly in the dying firelight, and she shook out the quilt, and she wrapped it around her own thin shoulders, the whole warm weight of 51 winters settling down over her like an embrace. And it was warm. Of course it was warm. It was made of nothing but the warmth they had saved year upon year against exactly such a night as this. She drew it close with the blue of the first square and the blue of the last square meeting somewhere over her heart, and she stood in the middle of the small bright room with the rain whispering on the roof, wrapped in the whole of her life, and she was not alone. She had never, she understood now, for one single night of all those years, been alone. He was in every square. He had told her so himself, and Henry had never once, in 51 years, told her a thing that was not true. If you are still here with me, in the warm and the quiet, with the rain coming down, then let this be the thought I leave you with as you drift off to sleep. That the people who love us are forever doing this quiet work on our behalf, choosing the cloth, leaving the warmth, making sure that when the hard nights come, we will have something to wrap around our shoulders. That love, the long and ordinary and faithful kind, does not end so much as it is sewn into things, into quilts and cottages and the sound of rain, where it waits patiently to keep us warm. And that somewhere in the lining of your own life, in a tin you have not opened, or a corner you were afraid to finish, there is very likely more warmth saved up for you than you have ever guessed. Edith sat back down by the embers, wrapped in her finished quilt, and she closed her eyes and she listened to the last of the rain, and she was content. And we can leave her there, warm and whole, with the fire glowing and the night soft around the little cottage at the end of the lane. There is nothing left for her to finish now. There is only the rest. Thank you for spending this hour with me. If you'd like more stories like this one, subscribe, and I'll leave the light on for you next time. Rest well.